but obviously that's way too high. That's not gonna work. That'll be in a later video. I'm curious to ride this thing. I think I'm just gonna strap this battery down with some cargo straps and see if it works. Okay, pay no mind to a lot of this stuff I'm doing. We're gonna get into all this later. But I've got the battery just strapped on right now. I just want to get a ride on this thing and see if it's gonna work. I can barely see that. This display, I have not even set it up yet. I'm not even sure how to. I can't figure it out. I have to be a lot lower to see. I need to tilt it forward more. Can't really see it anyway. We'll get into this app, had a Bluetooth to it, everything like that. And I can push the reverse button here, give it some gas, and it should reverse. There it goes. It's reversing. That's pretty cool. Oh, you probably have it reversed forward now. That's pretty hard to control backwards. We just want to see if this thing works. Holy crap, this thing is fast. Jesus Christ. I'm in gear 1. This is a 3-speed, so gear 1's reduced to 75%. Mode 2 is 80%, and then mode 3 is wide open. And let me tell you what, this thing feels like Jesus Christ. This thing feels like a 1,000cc bike. It'll easily do a wheelie in gear 1 right there. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's violent. That's crazy. This is a 20,000 watt motor. It's supposed to be good for 40,000 watts. And this is so smooth, guys. I just can't believe how smooth it is. It's just fast and smooth. It just drives like a dream. So your ears will tell you you're going faster. So the e-bike has no noise at all. It's dead quiet. But it's probably going a lot faster than I think it's going because it's dead quiet. If it were making a bunch of racket right now, I'd feel like it's going fast. Jesus, this thing is so fast. It literally just wants to wheelie up on me. Brakes work real good and they're really grabbing strong. Super smooth. The battery's just strapped on. I got to figure this out. I might have got way too big of a battery, but doing my calculations, that's what it came out to be. And I was probably wrong about that. All the lights work. All this stuff works really good so far. So I'm really happy with it. It just rides like a really nice bike, and it's just crazy fast. It reminds me of my old CBR's 929, maybe a Gixxer 1000, something in that category, honestly. Definitely faster than what a 600 would feel like. Of course, I haven't rode sport bikes since the early 2000s, so they could all be a lot faster now. But we're definitely hitting 10 seconds on them. I'm pretty confident with the temperature now. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in speedometer mode. Looks like I'm clear this way. Yeah, it's freaking fast, geez. Holy crap, this is amazing. Wow. That's so violently quick. Wow. I can't believe how awesome this is. It's going to take some getting used to. I mean, to be this small and that fast, that's crazy. Mode 2 feels like. Holy shit! Yeah! Whoa! I think I want to do mode 3. Yeah, I don't want to ride it too long. I need to get it back to the house and do a bolt check, make sure nothing's come loose, make sure everything's still tight. But dang, I mean, I'm maybe an eighth of a throttle and all that stuff. This is crazy how fast this bike is. It's just insane. Yeah, I'd probably, in hindsight, go with a smaller motor. All we need to make our electric scooter is a 50, a Mad Dog 50. Got one here and a pocket full of money. See what I got here. Yeah, that's not gonna work. Okay, I lied. We don't need a Mad Dog 50. I'm just going to use this 50. I could electrify any of these bikes. So this applies to anything you're going to electrify. You can put E on anything. I'm going to try to get it as bolt on as possible. You don't need a pocket full of money either. You just need a credit card, and I got one of those. The e-bike thing is a lot like the regular engine thing. It costs more to go faster, and it gets exponentially more. Crazy expensive to go fast. Electric stuff starts out pretty slow, slower than these gas engine bikes. I want to go over a quick primer on an electric, basic rundown of what you need to make your e-bike.
How can we make sure that all the statements that you said were correct?
Some of the things that I say will be incorrect. Nobody's going to bat 1,000. We will make mistakes, but we'll act quickly to correct any mistakes.
He's right. I am going to get some of this stuff wrong, but it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't matter that much. It's not going to be that wrong. The guys at Endless Fear were super helpful in educating me on this stuff. So yeah, game's over. I'm about to give the power to the people so everyone can know e-bike stuff. You've got a motor driving the back wheel. You've got a battery. Underneath this motor in here somewhere is a controller. Unlike your cars and your gas engines, this motor is probably the cheapest and least important thing on here. This motor is 750 watts. I can probably find it on AliExpress for under $200, honestly. Even though I say 750 watts for this motor, you can run this motor up to 2,500 watts, maybe 3,000 watts. So these motors can go way higher than the wattage they advertise. This is why the controller and the battery are so important. So you've got this $200 motor, and this battery is like $600. Doesn't make any sense. So the battery becomes a real expensive component. It's lithium ion. The batteries will come in 48 volts, 52 volts, maybe 60 volts. We get into bigger batteries for like our motorcycles, and they'll be 72 volts, 96 volts. The 17 amp hours is how large it is. If it was a 30 amp hour battery, it would be almost twice as big as this one. In this battery, there's also a computer. You can see it right down here where the power goes into this. This is like a little computer, and that computer is a battery management system. We don't want a Chinese battery fire. The manufacturer is going to put a maximum amount of amps that this thing can discharge at. So when this motor asks for amps to make your back wheel go, this battery is going to unload amps into that motor. How much it can happen is controlled by your battery management system. The battery management system will turn the battery off at a certain volt, so it won't even work. So the batteries are pretty high tech, and that's why they cost so much. Below this motor is a controller. So here's an example of a controller, and it controls how fast and how much the juice flows from this battery to this motor. Now I know I said it has a BMS in it, but the BMS is more like a limit switch, so you don't damage the battery. So the controller is where we set how much that motor can take. If you buy this bike like I did, already put together, the manufacturer's already set this controller up. So it's gonna give me the proper amount of power so I don't damage the motor, don't damage the battery. They've already done all the math, they've already done all the calculations, and it's a good, reliable bike. And this display unit is off the controller. The throttle works off the controller. The regenerative braking works off the controller. The mode switch works off the controller. The controller does everything. Before you start building your e-bike, you need to have a goal to start planning your bike. The goal is going to be comprised of 1, how fast do you want to go, and 2, how far do you want to drive? Now the obvious answer is I want to go 200 miles an hour and I want to drive around the world. But we have to be realistic. This is a lot of money to make like a Tesla, to make something like that. We're going to try to find the minimum things we can be happy with, the minimum speed I can be happy with, the minimum distance I can drive. So I'm just going to say for this plan that I want to go 60 miles an hour because I want to go out here on the county road and drive to work. I want to be able to cruise at 60 miles an hour. I'll be able to go faster than that because remember, these motors, they'll have a rated power of something like 5,000 watts, but then they'll have a peak power of maybe 10,000 watts in this case here. So if I want that 5,000 watt motor, that's going to take me a lot faster at that peak power. That's still going to make the bike fun. I'm still going to be able to get around 75 miles an hour when I want to get on it, but I'm going to lose range, obviously. But I want to be able to go 60 miles an hour to work, and we'll say for me to drive to work is 30 miles. And that could be drive to work, charge, drive back home there 30 miles, or it could be a 15-mile jaunt to work, and then you can't charge there and you're going 15 miles back home. How far do I need to drive in one shot? So we'll say 30 miles and 60 miles an hour we want to be able to attain. The first step we need to focus on is how fast we want to go. We can figure out the range we can go at that speed later. The first part of the plan is we got to decide what we're going to do. There's a mid-drive motor, which we saw on the bicycle over here, and that's pretty neat. And there's a lot of advantages of that. There's a hub drive motor. That's where the motor's in the back of the wheel. A lot of ways to skin this cat. For our plan, we're doing the 60 miles an hour. Now, personally, I'm gonna try to build this a lot faster than that. I've decided on a hub motor, and QS Motors has a pretty good name in the electric business. I like to go to their website. They don't really sell them on the website. I find them on Amazon and different places, AliExpress, but I like to go to their website because it has all the specs and all the numbers and all the details you need. We need to figure out how fast that back wheel turns at 60 miles an hour so we can determine what kind of RPM we want out of our hub drive motor. Keep in mind, these are not the parts I'm telling you to buy. This is purely the process you're going to use to figure out what parts you want. So I'm just going through here playing like a guy that wants to go 60. Wheel speed calculators. And we can go down here and put in, we want 60 miles an hour to cruise at. We got a 19-inch tire diameter. That's what a 12-inch wheel with a 70 profile tire comes out to be 19 inches. And so that's what you're shooting for. Looks like 1,061 RPM. Now we know what RPM we're looking for our motor to do, like around 1,000 RPM. And these QS motors, they list them over here on the left, all the different sizes. These are 14 inches, 13 inches, there's 12-inch ones. And man, this 12 by 7.5, that would be sweet. That's a nice fat tire. That would look cool. Big fat tire goes on there. It still looks like a Mad Dog or a 3,000 watt hub motor. Go down to the specs on it. You can see here, power 3,000 watts, 72 volts, 950 RPM, and that's pretty close. Let's see what that would give me on 950 RPM. Problem is with that stretched tire, I've noticed on my Gen 1, it has that 8-inch wheel. That 205 by 30, I think it is, whatever it is, it's only 18 inches. So we're talking about 50 miles an hour. We're going to lose 10 miles an hour there. I could put a 140 stretched on that wheel, and that would probably give me 18.5. It's a little bit shy of the 19 inches. 18.5, there's 52 miles an hour. Yeah, I don't know if I want to lose 10 miles an hour. A lot of times they'll tell the speed. You only have to do the calculations. This one says 70 kilometers per hour. They'll always say it in kilometers per hour. It's only a 43 mile an hour hub motor. It looks like we've got to get to these 3.5 inch wide wheels. Look at all the choices when you get 3.5 inch wide. That's about like the front wheel on your Mad Dog. That is not that wide. I've run a 140 tire on a 3.5 inch wheel. They call for a 130 tire, so it would be a 130 by 70 by 12. But I have run 140s on them. They look pretty narrow. It looked like a Gen 4 with this narrow tire on it. There's a 5,000 watt one. It is 95 kilometers per hour. We'll see if that lines up. That's 59. There's my 60 miles an hour right there. Now let's see what the RPM is and see if it actually correlates. RPM 840 RPM. Yeah, 48 miles an hour. So the 70 kilometers an hour might be at peak power. It's 5,000 rated power. It doesn't give us a peak power on here. Now one thing about these motors are they come in different speeds. The 3000 one does. It might be a higher speed motor. They can adjust the speed on these motors and make them high or low. And a lot of times they'll have a higher speed motor even though it has less kilowatts. Yeah, see this one here has speed at 72 volts. Look at that, 1330 RPM. And then it has these other speeds you can get it in. So what they're doing is they sell these motors in either a high torque version or a high speed version. 1030 is default, and that's what we're looking for is 1000 RPM. 1030, and that puts us at 60.4 miles an hour. That's perfect. So that might be the motor I would choose. It's 3,000 watts. It's 1030 RPM. It says 72 volts default. So keep all these numbers in mind. We want to look at the power chart for it. At our 1000 RPM, that's around 72 volts. It looks like it's running 98 amps. You can call it 100 amps. At the max RPM, we're looking at about 100 amps. Oh, there's a nice high RPM. Yeah, 1312. And it's pulling, yep, 98 amps right there. And it even has a recommended controller for it. But just keep that in mind when you find your motor. If it has a recommended controller, doesn't mean you have to use it. It's a good idea. That's a 72 volt 360 amps. See here we only say we need 100 amps, but to take this thing faster than 60, say we want to go 80 miles an hour on it, well now we're going to need to pull more amps. So see we're pulling 140 amps up here. There's 107 amps right there. Or like an acceleration burst, like let's say you're taking off from a stop sign, you're accelerating, you may pull quite a bit of amps. Something else you want to check out is the highest RPM they turn on this thing. So they're running it up here. We're going to do 72 volts. So yeah, these guys are getting around 1300 RPM with it. 1300 RPM on a 19-inch wheel. Yeah, that gives us 73 miles an hour top speed. This is not the motor I went with. This is just an example. I'm just showing you how to determine what you want. I ended up getting my motor through these guys here, SIA Ecosys. You'll see them on AliExpress, and they sell through AliExpress or Alibaba. AliExpress is actually a sub part of Alibaba if you don't buy in bulk. I contacted them directly. These guys are super smart. Tell them what you're trying to do. They'll hook you up with the right motor. When I ordered the motor, I ended up bypassing AliExpress and saved tons of money just wiring them the money directly. You save a lot of money bypassing AliExpress. Next thing we're going to need is a controller. They recommended this controller, 72 volts, 360 amps. The 72 volts is easy. That's the motor we got. 360 amps are phase amps. But we're looking for a controller for the motor we have, which is 3,000 watts. And this controller here says it's for 3,000 to 4,000 watts. So that'd be a good pick. Don't get hung up on the watts. They don't really matter. They're putting that on there just for our help. I know we want to use our 7,200 peak watts so we can go 70 something miles an hour. And we're still going to be able to with this, even though it says 3,000 to 4,000 watts. All right, this crap's about to get real confusing, so I'm going to try to simplify it. We'll say here's our e-bike battery. So if I hook a wire from the battery, that's a source, to my controller, that is line current. Now the line wire is your hot wire. That's got whatever voltage is coming from that battery, and it's going to deliver that voltage to the load. Now to get power from my controller to the motor, I need another wire. There's a wire here. This is phase current, and that's going to the motor. There's 3 phases on this motor. This motor is so heavy duty, the motor is requiring too much of a load for this line wire. So to run a heavy motor like this, we're going to run it in 3 phases. So this is a 3-phase motor. On each phase, 120 degrees out of phase with the other 2 phases. And now I can take the amps drawing off the line wire, and I can put that many amps through each of these phase wires. 100 amps coming in on the line wire, we'll say. So I've got 3 phase wires, but it wouldn't actually be 300 amps. It's actually just 100 amps still, but it's in 3 different phases. It's happening 3 times. And I'm summarizing a 10,000 page book on electricity into this little video, so I know it's all wrong. I'm just telling you how to think of it. Now your battery is not only advertised in amp hours, which you'll see, but it's also advertised in volts, and then it's advertised as amps and peak amps. And that's the BMS, the battery management system, controlling those amps and peak amps that it allows to flow through that line. It may say something like 100 amps and then 120 peak amps. And we can say that peak amps is good for 10 seconds. So you can pull 120 at 10 seconds and the rest of the time just 100 amps. And these are only line amps we're talking about when it comes to that battery. We get to the controller and they advertise this controller with volts again, sometimes watts, and then also amps and phase amps. It's going to take these line amps from the battery and it's going to divvy it up into phase amps. So you want to make sure your controller has a higher rated power than those battery amps. The more power this controller can take, the more expensive it's going to be. So you may see this controller advertised as 200 amps and then 360 phase amps, and the amount of volts, of course, 72 volts. So when you buy your controller, you know what volts you want, you know what your line amps are coming in off your battery. The $1,000,000 question is, how many phase amps do you get? Typically the controller is set up where the line amps and the phase amps kind of jive. But a good rule of thumb is set your phase amps at 2.5 times your line amps. So if our line amps were 100 amps, then the phase amps will be 250 to 300, somewhere in there. And that'll get you in the ballpark for buying the right controller. So this Indy 72360, I'll use an example. You're talking about 170 amps and then phase amps max 360. That's the amps going to the motor, and that would work. So that'd be a good size controller for our 100 amp battery that we're talking about getting. You may be wondering, well, how can we get 360 amps from 100 amps? This motor going like a ceiling fan at a nominal was what, 1030 RPM, only draws, if you take 3000 watts divided by 72, we're only drawing 41 amps. Even at peak power, 6000 watts divided by 72 is only 83 amps. So the amps aren't that great. But that's like a ceiling fan. That's just a motor going around at a constant speed forever, and we're only pulling that amps. We got to get the motor there. We got to be able to accelerate. To accelerate, we're going to use a lot more amps. So the nominal current to run this motor forever is only 41 amps. The manufacturer claims it can run a peak of 6000 watts. That would give us even a higher speed. But that's just based on this motor coming apart. That's where the bearings may start to fail. That's where it may start falling apart. That's really more of an RPM limit than it is a power limit when they say 6,000 watts. 6,000 watts divided by 72 equals 83 amps. So you might think that 83 amps is your limit, but it's not, as 6,000 watts was just an RPM limit. We can give this a lot more amps. We can give it as many amps as we want. These motors are generally good for about 10 times the rated amps. We just don't want to spin it that fast. What determines the limitation on this motor, for our purposes, is heat. It's RPM and heat. We don't want to over RPM it past our 6,000 watts, but we don't also want to overheat it. And that's where you start destroying your motors. So you want to have a temperature monitor on your motors, and you want to be able to read what that is to know if you're giving it too many amps. So even though we're running 72 volts to this motor in our scenario, that motor may not take 72 volts. If it's going 1000 RPM, it's taking 72 volts probably. But at a standstill, right now, it's taking 0 volts. It's not even moving. To start moving this wheel, it may not take 72 volts. We're delivering 72 volts to it, and we're delivering 100 amps in 3 phases. But it may only take 20 volts. at that point during the acceleration. So if you take your wattage of the motor and divide it by 20 volts, you're going to end up with a way bigger number than if you divide it by 72 volts. So you're going to be able to pull a lot more amps with this motor than the line amps coming in. And you're going to be able to do that because you have 3 phase wires all delivering the amount of amps that line amp's delivering. So let's go down and look at the specs on this. When you accelerate, the motor is going to try to draw a lot of amps. That motor will draw an infinite amount of amps. It will draw all the amps you have until it melts itself. As long as the demand is there, it's going to try to draw amps. It's going to catch on fire and burn up. This controller is going to limit how many amps it can draw. And that's why I put the 360 there, because this controller limits the amps that it can draw to 360. The controller regulates power flow from the battery to the motor. It controls the motor's acceleration, the torque, everything. And it does everything by limiting the amps that the motor can draw. And here it says its available power is 2,400 watts to 4,000 watts, and we're in there because we got a 3,000 watt motor. Its available battery voltage is 48, 60, and 72. We're in there. We got a 72 volt motor. So picking the controller is not that hard. The battery is probably the toughest part to figure out. 3 or 4 numbers you need to know: the volts, the amp hours, and the max continuous amps and the peak amps that are able to be pulled from the battery via the BMS. Remember, the BMS is a battery management system. It's going to limit the amount of amps that come out of this battery. It's just there to protect the battery. It doesn't care about your e-bike. It just wants to keep this battery from getting too hot and melting and catching on fire. So it's going to protect the battery only. The volts are easy. We know we want 72 volts. We know we were burning 77 amps at 60 miles an hour. But now we're going to try to figure out range. We want to use the actual amps we're going to draw at 60, and that's 77 amps, according to the chart we saw. So if we go 60 miles in 1 hour and we draw 77 amps the whole time, that means we're drawing 77 amps in 1 hour. But we only want to go 30 miles. So if we take our 30 miles and divide that by 60, the miles we want to go, not time, we know it's going to equal 0.5. So 0.5 times 1 hour, obviously that's going to be back to 30. So we want to use 77 amp draw for half an hour. 0.5. Take that, 0.5 times 77, and for us to go 30 miles, we need 38.5 amp hour battery. And you'll find these batteries in like 40, 60. I mean, it's best to put the biggest battery you can in there, get a little bit more range, because with this 38.5 figure, that means our battery is going to die at 30 miles. Now remember, this battery has a BMS in it. That BMS is going to keep this battery from being depleted all the way. It's a 72 volt battery, so somewhere around maybe 60 volts, it's going to turn itself off. We may not get that full 30 miles. You probably want to go a little bit bigger than you planned on the battery. But luckily, the math works out a little bit different according to the guys on the forum. They say you're only usually burning around 40 to 60 amp when the math says 77. So that'll give us a little bit of a buffer. I would say on this plan to use a 40 amp hour battery. 40 amp hours divided by our 77 amps equals 0.519 times 60 minutes. That gives us 31 minutes of drive time at 77 amps. These numbers are very ballpark. There's just too many variables involved. We're not going to come out with an accurate distance or time on this thing. We're just kind of making our best guess. So now we need to look for a 72 volt 40 amp hour battery. We can find these everywhere. That's a pretty common size. And that battery's going to weigh around 50 pounds. If you really wanted to have good range, you could go to a 100 amp battery. Problem you run into is the battery size and weight gets too much. Some of these 100 amp batteries can weigh almost 200 pounds. The size gets so big you can't fit it anywhere. But for this goal, we wanted to go 30 miles, 40 amp battery. So here's one on Amazon. Pretty good deal, 72 volts, 40 amps, $388. That seems pretty cheap. The battery is supposed to be the most expensive part of this build. And let's see what the issues are we're going to have with this. Go on here and look at the specs. The size is not too bad. It'll probably fit right where the gas tank used to be. That gas tank area I think is like 14 by 16. So it's got a weight of 18 kilograms. I think it's around 40 pounds. Not real sure. Maximum constant discharge current. Now this is what the BMS is doing. The manufacturers put something on here to protect their battery from melting. They're only going to let you take 100 amps out of this battery constantly. That actually works because we're only going to be pulling 77 amps. Maximum peak discharge amp, 200. That would probably work also. To do 74 miles an hour, we said it was 140 amps. So theoretically, this would work. It's like it's got poor ratings. Don't waste your money. It's a piece of junk. You typically get what you pay for. Do not buy. If you want to lose your house to a fire, Don't buy this battery. Junk. And this is important. You see these little strips, tiny little strips of copper that connect all these batteries? When you try to draw too many amps out of your battery, this is what happens. They melt. This is your Chinese battery fire. You're drawing too many amps. So the battery manufacturer limits this with the BMS, so you can't overdraw on the amps. So this manufacturer did give it the amount of amps on its BMS to pull 200 amps. The problem is this battery's not built high enough quality. Look at these tiny little thin strips. And because of that low quality, they overheated and caught on fire when he pulled 200 amps. So be aware of a battery that fits your numbers and is cheap. $388? Yeah, I doubt it. If you look at a real battery, let's take this Suron battery. This thing's $2,775 and it's made for a Suron. This thing will pull 300 amps continuous discharge. It's probably much higher on a peak discharge. That's why these expensive batteries cost so much more. They're built with a lot better components, a lot thicker copper, better batteries, and they're also heavier. They're a lot heavier. They're built that much better. We'll go back to Amazon. Here's one for, see what we're looking for, a 40 amp? Well, let's look at this 100 amp one. So yeah, $2,000 for a 100 amp battery. That's probably pretty cheap still. A 100 amp battery is going to be a lot more. Remember this Gladiator we were looking at was a 60 amp hour battery for $2,700. So this one for $2,000 and 100 amps is probably cheap. And let's see the problem with it. Constant discharge current, 30 amps. So it's got a built-in 30 amp BMS. That's not even enough to get our bike to go fast as we want. We need 77 amps to go 60 miles an hour. This is not going to do it. We can stop looking at this battery now. Price is a dead giveaway if it's built right or not. Here's a 60 amp hour, 72 volt. Yeah, perfect. It's $2,318. That's probably a pretty good one. That's got the right price. It says good for 1,000 watt to 5,600 watt motor. That's us. Weighs 50 pounds. The weight's on there, and it's got a built-in BMS, looks like 100 amps. Now that will work. So it's got protection of 100 amps with overcharge protection, and this is nice. Maximum peak discharge, 200 amp. That's what we need. We want to get that 140 amps out of our battery to be able to drive that motor fast enough to go 70 something miles an hour. And we also want to do a constant of 100 amps so we can use a 77 amps to go 60. So this battery falls in there. The price is right. It's a high price, so it's probably quality. And the weight's in there, about 50 pounds. Well, it's got no reviews. Probably no one's buying it because it costs so much compared to the cheap ones, but you get what you pay for. Probably going to have a lot thicker copper in it. It's probably not going to melt. They may custom make it the sizes you want. Well, that's a good contender. And if you notice, the peak amps and the discharge current all correlate with the price. And as the quality goes up, you get a higher discharge amp, a better BMS, and a higher peak discharge amp. So that's how you pick your battery. And that's going to be the most expensive thing you buy. The battery's more dependent on what you want to do. You know, how far do you want to drive? What speeds do you want to go? Tailored to your personal preference. I went with this Amorje battery. It's got really good reviews online. All the guys that really know these e-bikes swear by this battery. Yeah, I'll put a link to this website in the description, and also this video here. Here's a review of
these. Things are awesome. I would love to get my hands on a set of these.
He tore a new Amorje battery apart and reviewed it. Gave it great reviews.
If you're on the fence about a Amorje battery, I would honestly say that you have absolutely nothing to worry about. It's definitely one of the best built batteries I have seen. It's nice. It's a nice battery. They did a nice job.
You hear a lot of stuff about battery fires and Chinese batteries, and it's because people are matching stuff wrong. It's because the manufacturers are making cheap batteries, and usually you can tell if they're lighter weight and if they're lower priced. So go shopping, and we'll do a video on how to build this thing next.